In the wooded outskirts of Fairford, Massachusetts, the Blackmoor estate dominated the horizon. Its white-pillared facade and sprawling gardens suggested refinement, yet behind the shuttered windows lay a history that local residents rarely spoke of in public. Between 1855 and 1895, the family name became entangled with unverified accounts of closed-door dealings, unrecorded visitors, and administrative irregularities tied to their many business ventures. Official documents were scarce, but fragments from municipal archives hinted at a coordinated effort to preserve an image that no longer matched reality. The Blackmoor family was widely regarded as a pillar of civic progress. They funded public schools, donated to church renovations, and maintained an immaculate social presence through charitable banquets and lectures on education reform. Visitors to Fairford saw them as an embodiment of American prosperity in the late 19th century. Yet those who lived near the estate spoke quietly about its unusual routines. Servants were seldom replaced, yet never seen leaving, and deliveries occurred at irregular hours. While newspapers praised their philanthropic contributions, town records from the period reveal a complex network of trusts, land holdings, and private contracts that rarely faced public scrutiny. The arrival of the Blackmoor family in Fairford was recorded in 1855 with the formality expected of the period. Their move from Boston was accompanied by an official reception at the town hall, followed by invitations to private gatherings at their estate. From the beginning, their presence was defined by meticulous social choreography. The estate was opened selectively to influential guests, and those who attended were later quoted in the Fairford Gazette praising its refinement. The Blackmoors quickly acquired a reputation for elevating the cultural standing of the town, bringing with them a library of imported volumes, rare decorative pieces, and a landscaped garden modeled after European designs. The head of the family, Jonathan Blackmoor, presented himself as a businessman with varied interests, though few details of his ventures were made public. Land records indicated he had purchased several small textile mills in neighboring counties, but operational information was sparse. When asked, he would speak broadly about industry, employment, and the importance of self-reliance. His wife, Eleanor Blackmoor, was often seen in the company of local church committees and charitable boards promoting literacy and the arts. She was known for hosting seasonal events in which selected townspeople could view imported artworks displayed in the east wing of the estate. The Blackmoor children were educated privately, with tutors arriving from Boston or occasionally from overseas. Town records show no enrollment in local schools, yet they were sometimes observed at public functions, standing quietly beside their parents. Conversations about them in town tended to focus on their formality and reserved manner, rather than personal achievements. While this approach was unusual for Fairford's close-knit community, it was generally interpreted as a sign of refinement. In the years following their arrival, the family's financial influence became evident in civic projects. Jonathan Blackmoor pledged significant sums to the renovation of Fairford's Central Library, securing a plaque with his name in the main reading room. Eleanor oversaw the restoration of the town's botanical gardens, ensuring her involvement was well documented in newspaper articles. The family also acquired several downtown properties, which they leased to merchants aligned with their preferred image of Fairford as a center for cultured commerce. By 1860, however, municipal council records began to reflect a subtle shift in the nature of the family's interactions with local governance. Requests for property improvements, market licenses, and transport permits linked to Blackmoor holdings were processed more quickly than those of other citizens. Some council members noted the lack of standard oversight, though no official complaints were recorded. This quiet facilitation allowed the Blackmoors to expand their influence without drawing undue attention from the wider public. The estate itself became a focal point of curiosity. While the main drive was occasionally visible from the road, tall hedges and a series of wrought iron gates ensured that most of the property remained unseen. Deliveries arrived through a side entrance, often in covered wagons that concealed their contents. Records from the Fairford delivery office list frequent shipments from Boston's port, but the manifests were vague, describing goods as household provisions, personal effects, or seasonal supplies. On rare occasions when townspeople were invited beyond the main hall, the visit was carefully guided, with access restricted to a handful of rooms. Servants employed by the family were rarely replaced, and their appearances in town were infrequent. When they did appear, it was usually for specific errands, and they returned directly to the estate. Questions about working conditions were met with polite but brief answers. Payroll documents found in later archives indicate that many staff members had been with the family for decades, some predating their move to Fairford. The consistency of this staff was unusual for the period, given the common practice of rotating household workers between estates. In local social circles, the Blackmoors were seen as both accessible and unreachable. They attended public lectures, charity fundraisers, and the occasional civic meeting, always contributing generously to the cause at hand. Yet casual visits to the estate were unheard of, and social invitations were extended selectively. It was understood that proximity to the Blackmoors could elevate a family's standing in Fairford, and as such, those who enjoyed their company in private were reluctant to speak in detail about it. An early example of their influence occurred in 1863, when the Blackmoors funded the construction of a new railway platform just outside the town centre. Officially, it was to improve trade connections for local farmers and merchants. In practice, the line's freight records show a disproportionate number of shipments bound directly for Blackmoor-owned warehouses in neighbouring towns. Publicly, the platform was celebrated as a symbol of Fairford's modernisation. Privately, it reinforced the family's control over a significant portion of regional commerce. The Blackmoor name began appearing in regional newspapers beyond Fairford, often in connection with charitable donations or cultural sponsorships. An 1865 article in the Boston Chronicle praised Jonathan's vision for educational reform, highlighting his funding of evening classes for workers in industrial towns. While the initiative was applauded, the article contained no details on how the program was administered, nor on the selection process for beneficiaries. Archival research would later show that many of these programs were managed through a network of trustees, several of whom had direct ties to Blackmoor business interests. Despite the growing public image of the family as benefactors, certain patterns began to draw quiet notice among more observant townspeople. The estate's windows were often shuttered during daylight hours, even in the height of summer. Correspondence arriving at the post office for the Blackmoors was frequently marked for forwarding to distant addresses, some of which were outside Massachusetts. Additionally, the family's travel patterns were irregular, with long absences from public view, followed by sudden reappearances at key civic events. By the late 1860s, Fairford's town records show that the Blackmoors had become significant landholders in the surrounding countryside. Transactions were often conducted through intermediaries, making it difficult to trace the extent of their holdings. Maps from the period, however, indicate that much of the land adjacent to the railway belonged to them directly or to associated parties. This consolidation of property granted them considerable influence over trade routes and agricultural distribution, further entrenching their position in the local economy. In conversation, townspeople continued to speak of the family with a mixture of admiration and guarded curiosity. Few claimed to know them well, yet most could recall moments when the Blackmoors' decisions had shaped the direction of the town. These could be as small as the approval of a new shop, or as large as the establishment of a civic project. While many accepted this as the natural consequence of wealth and social status, there were occasional murmurs about the selective nature of their involvement in public life. The estate's gardens, often cited as one of its most impressive features, became a subject of particular intrigue. Open to the public only once each year, they were said to contain plant species rarely seen in New England. Visitors described precise arrangements and an atmosphere of careful maintenance. Yet the annual viewing was strictly timed, with attendants guiding visitors along a fixed route. Certain sections of the grounds were always roped off, their contents unseen by the public. This curated access mirrored the family's broader approach to their public image. Information was released selectively, designed to reinforce a narrative of refinement, benevolence, and civic-mindedness. The Blackmoors cultivated an appearance of openness without ever allowing full visibility into their affairs. Those who sought more detailed understanding found themselves facing polite deflection, procedural delays, or incomplete records. By 1870, this balance between visibility and seclusion had become a defining characteristic of the Blackmoor presence in Fairford. Their influence was woven into the civic, economic, and cultural fabric of the town, yet the true extent of their operations remained obscured from public record. As the next decades unfolded, this tension between perception and reality would quietly shape the town's relationship with its most prominent residents. Throughout the 1870s, the Blackmoor estate's physical expansion continued in ways that were visible from the main road, but provided little insight into the activities within. A new wing was constructed on the north side, designed in a style reminiscent of English country houses, with tall, narrow windows and decorative stonework. Local builders hired for the project noted the precision of the plans and the insistence on imported materials. Stone blocks arrived from quarries in Vermont, while wood for interior paneling came from distant suppliers. The work proceeded without interruption, overseen by a foreman who was rarely seen outside the property. During this period, Jonathan Blackmoor deepened his involvement in regional trade organizations. He accepted a position as an honorary advisor to the Massachusetts Merchants' Assembly, attending meetings in Boston and Worcester. Although the role was described as ceremonial, minutes from the assembly indicate that he contributed suggestions regarding transport tariffs and export schedules. These proposals often benefited routes connected to the Fairford railway platform or to depots associated with his warehouses. His growing profile in business circles further elevated Fairford's standing, attracting traders and investors who viewed the town as a place of stable and well-connected commerce. Eleanor Blackmoor maintained a parallel presence in cultural and charitable pursuits. She chaired the Fairford Arts Committee, which sponsored traveling exhibitions and lectures. A notable example was the 1873 exhibition of European lithographs held in the town hall, with the Blackmoor name prominently displayed on the program. Such events were well attended and often covered in regional newspapers. Behind the scenes, Eleanor worked with select members of the committee to choose the exhibits, determining which artists and themes aligned with the town's image as a cultivated community. While these choices were generally well received, they also reinforced the Blackmoors' role as arbiters of cultural life. Invitations to the estate remained rare and carried a distinct sense of exclusivity. The guest lists often included visiting business leaders, educators, or public officials. Meals were served in the central dining room, a space said to be lined with paintings depicting pastoral scenes. Conversations were formal, focused on trade, civic improvements, and educational philosophy. Local attendees understood that such invitations were not casual social gestures, but carefully curated opportunities for alignment with the family's interests. The Blackmoor children, now young adults, began to appear more frequently at public functions. They accompanied their parents to lectures, library openings, and seasonal fairs, speaking politely with attendees, but offering little about their personal lives. It was generally assumed they would inherit their parents' responsibilities, though no public statements confirmed this. Their presence was seen as an indication that the family intended to maintain its role in Fairford's future affairs. Economic indicators from the mid-1870s suggest that the family's influence extended beyond cultural and charitable work. Agricultural reports show that farms closest to the railway line, owned or controlled by Blackmoor interests, experienced consistent transport priority. Goods from these farms reached markets faster, and their produce fetched higher prices. Merchants in town also noted that certain shops enjoyed more favorable leasing terms in Blackmoor-owned properties. While such arrangements were never formally documented as preferential, patterns in pricing and access were apparent to those who worked within the system. The estate's interior underwent another round of renovations in 1878, according to surviving receipts from a Boston furniture supplier. These records list custom-built cabinetry, imported rugs, and large quantities of glassware. The renovation coincided with a marked increase in the family's private gatherings, though details about the nature of these events were scarce. What is known from delivery logs is that during this time, the estate received shipments of preserved foods, fine wines, and a range of stationery materials, suggesting a combination of formal dining and administrative activity. As the 1880s began, The Blackmoors took on an even greater role in shaping Fairford's public image. They supported the creation of a town archive, donating funds for a dedicated reading room and storage space for historical documents. The project was presented as an act of civic preservation, with speeches emphasizing the value of remembering Fairford's past. The Blackmoors also provided several items from their personal collection, though researchers noted that these donations were carefully selected to highlight certain aspects of local history while omitting others. The archive's official curator was a man with prior business connections to the family, ensuring that the management of the collection aligned with their vision. Around the same period, the family began acquiring additional property near the river, a location well suited for milling operations. Publicly, these purchases were described as investments to improve regional industry. Unofficially, surveyor maps show that the acquisitions created a continuous stretch of land under their control, linking the river to the railway. This consolidation of transport and production assets positioned the family to influence multiple stages of the supply chain, from manufacturing to distribution. Despite the growing scope of their holdings, the Blackmoors remained committed to presenting themselves as private citizens devoted to community welfare. They sponsored seasonal lectures on agricultural innovation, often inviting speakers from outside Massachusetts. They also contributed to infrastructure improvements, such as the installation of new street lamps in the town center. These projects reinforced their reputation as benefactors, while simultaneously ensuring that civic development followed patterns that supported their broader interests. In 1884, the estate's gardens were again the subject of public fascination. That year's annual viewing included new plantings of ornamental trees and an expanded greenhouse visible from the main path. Visitors described the greenhouse as containing species unfamiliar to them, though guides provided minimal explanation of their origin or purpose. The roped-off sections of the grounds remained in place, prompting quiet speculation about what lay beyond them. The event was accompanied by refreshments, served in a temporary pavilion, where Eleanor greeted guests and emphasized the importance of horticulture in civic life. Business registers from the mid-1880s reveal that the family's influence had begun to extend into neighboring towns. Blackmoor-owned companies or affiliated firms acquired stakes in warehouses, shipping depots, and agricultural supply outlets in several nearby counties. These acquisitions were conducted through layers of intermediaries, making it difficult for the average observer to identify the connections. Nevertheless, trade patterns showed a steady increase in goods moving along routes linked to the Fairford railway platform. By the close of the decade, the Blackmoors had become synonymous with the town's prosperity. Civic leaders consulted them on development projects, and their approval was often seen as essential for gaining public support. Yet their selective approach to engagement meant that not all proposals advanced. Projects aligned with their interests moved forward quickly, while others encountered delays or procedural obstacles. Though such outcomes were never attributed directly to the family, the correlation was noted by those who tracked the town's administrative decisions. The 1890s brought further physical changes to the estate. Archival photographs from 1891 show the addition of a decorative fountain in the central courtyard, surrounded by meticulously arranged flower beds. At the same time, the estate's perimeter walls were reinforced with additional masonry, reducing visibility from the surrounding area. This development, while explained as a measure for preserving privacy, deepened the impression of separation between the family and the town. During these years, Jonathan gradually reduced his public appearances, delegating more responsibilities to his eldest son. This transition was marked by the younger Blackmoor's attendance at trade meetings and his involvement in property negotiations. Eleanor maintained her cultural commitments, though her events became smaller in scale, often focused on specialized topics in the arts or education. The family's role in civic life continued, but its visibility shifted toward a quieter, more calculated form of participation. By 1895, the Blackmoor estate had been part of Fairford for 4 decades. Its physical presence dominated the outskirts, while its influence shaped the town's economy, culture, and public identity. Yet the structures of their involvement, from selective property acquisitions to carefully curated public events, ensured that much about their operations remained inaccessible to ordinary citizens. What could be seen projected stability and refinement, but much of the substance remained behind closed gates and carefully managed appearances. In the early months of 1872, the town clerk's office began receiving inquiries from external parties regarding land availability near the railway platform. These requests, often arriving from merchants in Boston or Providence, were typically redirected to the Blackmoor estate, rather than being processed through municipal channels. No formal explanation was recorded for this practice, but the arrangement persisted for several years. The effect was that anyone seeking to establish a presence in the most commercially advantageous locations needed to secure Blackmoor approval before proceeding. Among residents who paid close attention to such matters, this unusual arrangement was quietly noted, but rarely questioned openly. Fairford was a small enough community that most people preferred to avoid challenging those who contributed generously to its public works. As long as improvements continued and the economy appeared stable, there was little appetite for investigating the precise mechanics behind them. One of the earliest indications that the family's influence might not be entirely transparent came from the case of a proposed grain storage facility in 1874. The project, backed by a consortium of local farmers, was intended to reduce transport costs by allowing bulk shipments to be consolidated before being sent to market. The proposal initially met with enthusiasm at public meetings, but over the course of several months, it became delayed by a sequence of administrative complications. The required permits were postponed, and a reassessment of the site's suitability was ordered. By the time the project was finally approved, a different storage facility, operated through a Blackmoor-affiliated company, had already been established nearby. The individuals involved in the farmers' proposal did not speak publicly against the outcome, and contemporary accounts suggest that some eventually sold their interest in the original project to the newly established facility. Town records offer no direct connection to the Blackmoor family, but shipping manifests from the following year indicate that the majority of grain exports from Fairford passed through their controlled warehouse. The pattern was not limited to agriculture. In 1876, an out-of-town textile manufacturer sought to lease property near the railway for a small production site. Initial negotiations appeared promising, with favorable press coverage describing the potential for job creation. Yet after a series of private meetings between the manufacturer and unspecified parties, the plan was abandoned. Within a year, a similar operation was opened under the name of a company whose board included 2 individuals with documented business ties to the Blackmoors. The original manufacturer never issued a public statement regarding the withdrawal, and local reports described the eventual opening as a successful example of regional investment. Administrative processes in Fairford reflected these quiet interventions. Property valuations for Blackmoor-owned holdings tended to remain stable even during periods when surrounding land values increased. Licenses and renewals for businesses connected to the family were processed quickly, often within a single council session. Other applicants sometimes waited weeks or months for comparable approvals. While there was no overt suggestion of improper conduct, the difference in timing was evident in the municipal ledgers preserved in the town archive. The estate's own records from the period are sparse, but certain invoices and correspondence survive in unrelated collections. These documents suggest a level of coordination between the family and select civic officials, particularly in matters involving transport logistics. For instance, a surviving letter from an intermediary to a warehouse contractor outlines preferred delivery times that correspond closely with shifts in railway scheduling approved by the Municipal Transport Board. By the late 1870s, some residents began to remark on the infrequency with which town decisions affecting commerce appeared to diverge from Blackmoor interests. Proposals that aligned with their holdings proceeded with minimal resistance, while unrelated ventures often encountered delays. This observation rarely made its way into public discourse, as it was generally understood that such matters were best left unexamined if the town wished to maintain its steady flow of improvements and investments. One of the more subtle indicators of the family's selective involvement came in the form of charitable commitments. While they continued to support prominent public initiatives such as the library, gardens, and lecture series, smaller community projects without clear commercial benefits often struggled to secure their attention. A notable example occurred in 1881, when a group of residents petitioned for the construction of a new footbridge over the Eastern Stream to connect two growing residential areas. The petition was well supported by those living in the affected neighborhoods, but failed to secure funding. That same year, however, the Blackmoors financed the construction of a decorative bridge within their own estate grounds, a feature that was highlighted in the annual garden viewing. The selective nature of their public engagement did not diminish the perception of the family as civic leaders. In fact, their ability to focus on projects with broad visual or cultural appeal strengthened their position. Photographs and illustrations from the period often depict members of the family in front of newly completed public works, their names included in dedication plaques and ceremonial programs. For many townspeople, these visible contributions outweighed the less obvious patterns in municipal decision-making. The estate's influence extended even into matters of record-keeping. Several official documents from the 1880s contain amendments or corrections made in handwriting that does not match the standard clerical style of the town offices. While these adjustments were not unusual in themselves, researchers have noted that they often coincided with transactions involving Blackmoor-related properties or contracts. The amendments typically involved clarifications of land boundaries or adjustments to contractual terms, and in every surviving case, the revisions appeared to favor the family's position. Fairford's economic stability during this time further discouraged any sustained inquiry into these matters. Employment was steady, trade routes were reliable, and public services benefited from consistent funding. Those who might have been inclined to question the family's influence often recognized that doing so could risk disrupting an arrangement that seemed to benefit the majority. In private, a few merchants expressed concerns about the difficulty of operating independently of Blackmoor networks, but such conversations rarely extended beyond trusted circles. By the mid-1880s, the concentration of influence had reached a point where even regional authorities appeared to defer to the family's preferences. Correspondence between the Fairford Council and a neighboring county board regarding a proposed cross-county trade agreement shows that the timing of negotiations was adjusted to accommodate the Blackmoors' schedule of business meetings. The agreement ultimately included provisions that allowed certain goods to move along routes under their control without additional tariffs, a detail that was framed publicly as an incentive for all regional merchants. Throughout these developments, the family maintained their pattern of selective visibility. They appeared at public events in measured intervals, ensuring their image remained associated with progress and refinement. When questions arose about the prioritization of certain projects, the response was framed in terms of efficiency, civic pride, or alignment with the town's long-term goals. The lack of direct confrontation meant that such explanations were generally accepted. The combination of economic benefit, controlled public image, and administrative alignment created an environment in which the family's influence became both pervasive and largely unquestioned. While occasional discrepancies in procedure or decision-making were observable to those who examined the records closely, there was no formal challenge to their position. This absence of opposition would remain a defining feature of Fairford's governance for years to come, even as the underlying structures continued to evolve in ways that left much beyond the view of the ordinary resident. By 1886, the patterns that had developed in Fairford's governance and commerce had become embedded in the town's daily operations. For many residents, the interconnected nature of business opportunities, property transactions, and civic projects meant that it was difficult to distinguish where municipal policy ended and private influence began. This merging of roles was reinforced by the family's careful attention to public perception. Every visible action was framed within a context of improvement, modernity, and shared prosperity. That same year, the municipal council authorized the expansion of the town's central market square. On paper, the decision followed a series of public meetings and feasibility studies. In practice, records show that preliminary land purchases for the expansion had been made months earlier by a holding company whose directors included two known Blackmoor associates. Once the expansion was announced, these properties were transferred to the town at prices that, while reasonable by recorded standards, ensured the holding company received a significant return. The completed market square was celebrated as a triumph of civic planning, its origins left largely unexplored by the public. The same approach could be observed in the way transport schedules were altered to favor certain trade flows. In 1888, a seasonal adjustment to the railway timetable was implemented to accommodate increased agricultural shipments from nearby counties. Although presented as a general benefit to all farmers, shipping records reveal that the greatest gains were realized by estates located along routes connected to Blackmoor-owned warehouses. For smaller producers without direct access to these facilities, the timetable changes had little impact. Yet in public meetings, the adjustments were repeatedly cited as evidence of the town's responsiveness to regional needs. An important part of maintaining this arrangement lay in the circulation of information. Town notices, meeting minutes, and official announcements were often prepared with language that emphasized unity and progress. Projects involving the family or their affiliates were described with particular attention to their benefits, while details of their origins or specific contractual terms were minimal. This editorial approach extended to regional newspapers, many of which relied on press releases prepared by the same clerks who managed the town's internal communications. Over time, this consistency of presentation created a shared narrative that few saw reason to question. Property acquisitions in the 1890s followed a similarly unobtrusive pattern. Purchases were made through intermediaries, with deeds transferring to the family or related entities only after any public discussion had subsided. This ensured that by the time a new acquisition became common knowledge, it was already integrated into their broader holdings. One notable instance involved a tract of land along the Western Road, initially purchased by a merchant cooperative for storage purposes. When the cooperative dissolved due to internal disagreements, the property was sold quietly to a local broker, who within a year transferred ownership to a company registered at the same address as a known Blackmoor business office. Municipal budgets from the period reflect the family's selective participation in funding public works. Their contributions often targeted projects that were visible, such as decorative features in the town centre, improvements to main thoroughfares, and sponsorship of public festivals. Less visible infrastructure, including drainage repairs or school maintenance, typically relied on standard taxation rather than private donation. This approach ensured that their name was consistently associated with high-profile developments, while less prominent needs remained outside their direct involvement. As their influence deepened, the mechanisms for sustaining it became more refined. Council elections during the decade saw an increasing number of candidates who had prior associations with the family's enterprises or charitable committees. While there is no record of formal endorsements, campaign materials often mentioned participation in Blackmoor-sponsored events as a sign of civic engagement. Once in office, these officials tended to support measures that aligned with the family's economic and cultural interests, often citing the importance of maintaining stability and progress. A notable development occurred in 1892, when plans were introduced for a regional trade fair to be hosted in Fairford. The proposal received immediate support from the family, with Eleanor offering the estate's gardens as a venue for select exhibits. The fair attracted merchants, artisans, and visitors from several counties, reinforcing the town's reputation as a centre for commerce and culture. In the months following the event, property values near the railway and market square rose significantly, benefiting landowners with holdings in those areas. Many of these owners were directly or indirectly connected to the Blackmoor network. The preservation of their position relied on a balance between accessibility and control. The family remained visible through their patronage of public events, ensuring that their contributions were noticed and appreciated. At the same time, decisions about the scope, timing, and nature of these contributions remained entirely in their hands. By choosing projects with broad appeal and aligning them with moments of civic celebration, they reinforced the perception that their interests and those of the town were inseparable. Documentation from business registries in the mid-1890s shows that the family's enterprises extended into new sectors, including small-scale manufacturing and regional distribution services. These ventures were often established under neutral names, avoiding any direct association with the estate. Contracts for supplying municipal departments with goods such as paper, furniture, and construction materials increasingly went to companies within this network. While the bidding processes were technically open, the same firms appeared repeatedly in the winning positions, suggesting that familiarity and established relationships played a decisive role. The family's approach to public discourse remained careful and measured. When speaking at events, Jonathan or his children rarely addressed specific business matters, focusing instead on themes of civic duty, education, and the shared heritage of Fairford. This avoidance of direct comment on their commercial activities helped maintain the distinction between their public identity as benefactors and their private role as economic strategists. It also limited opportunities for others to raise pointed questions in public forums. By 1895, the network of relationships between the estate, local governance, and regional commerce had reached a level of integration that was difficult to separate into distinct components. Decisions in one sphere often influenced outcomes in the others, and the individuals involved frequently moved between roles in business, politics, and cultural institutions. For residents accustomed to this arrangement, it appeared as a natural feature of the town's development. For outsiders, it was a system that operated with remarkable efficiency, though its inner workings remained largely opaque. The absence of formal opposition or investigative inquiry during these years allowed the family's influence to remain stable. Economic indicators were favorable, cultural life was active, and civic projects continued to appear at regular intervals. The selective nature of these developments meant that while some areas of the town advanced rapidly, others remained relatively unchanged. This uneven progress was generally overlooked in favor of celebrating the most visible achievements. In the closing years of the century, the Blackmoors maintained their position without significant alteration. They adapted to shifts in market demand, expanded into new commercial territories, and continued to align themselves with public works that reinforced their image. The structures they had put in place over decades ensured that even as individual projects concluded or officials changed, the underlying framework of influence persisted with minimal disruption. In 1893, a series of correspondence preserved in a private collection outside Fairford revealed a different dimension to the estate's relationship with the surrounding region. The letters exchanged between a shipping agent in New Haven and an intermediary linked to the Blackmoor network discussed the allocation of warehouse space during peak export months. The exchanges suggested a pre-arranged system in which specific facilities would be reserved for goods connected to the family's enterprises, regardless of broader demand. Although such agreements were not unlawful, the arrangement allowed them to maintain consistent distribution capacity at times when other merchants were forced to delay shipments. Similar patterns emerged in the records of the Fairford Railway Office. While freight logs listed all consignments in the same format, subtle notations in the margins indicated priority handling for certain shipments. These consignments often originated from properties or companies tied to the Blackmoor holdings. Railway staff familiar with the process likely viewed it as routine, and no formal complaints appear in the preserved ledgers. Yet the consistency of these entries suggests an operational preference that extended well beyond Fairford's municipal boundaries. That same year, an account from a regional timber supplier provided further insight into the scope of these arrangements. The supplier's ledger included repeated entries for deliveries to properties not listed in the Fairford Land Registry, but located within the family's broader sphere of influence. The use of such off-registry sites enabled goods to be stored, processed, or redirected without attracting local attention. While these activities did not directly affect the town's public life, they formed part of a larger framework in which the family's control over trade was reinforced by an intricate network of storage and transport facilities. In civic matters, their influence continued to appear in subtle procedural choices. Minutes from an 1894 council meeting recorded a discussion about the location of a new municipal storehouse. 3 potential sites were considered, with one positioned on land owned by a company connected to the Blackmoors. Although the other two sites were closer to the town centre and offered lower lease costs, the connected property was ultimately chosen. The recorded justifications cited its superior accessibility to the railway, a point that, while accurate, also ensured that goods moving through the storehouse would be situated within the family's established transport network. Town records also show adjustments to zoning boundaries in the years preceding 1895. While the changes were described as part of a general modernization plan, the revised lines frequently encompassed parcels later purchased by intermediaries linked to the estate. Once incorporated into new zoning categories, these parcels were eligible for development under more favorable conditions. The sequence of events in each case varied, but the outcome consistently positioned the family to benefit from subsequent increases in property value. Another area in which their influence became apparent was the awarding of supply contracts for civic events. Annual fairs, seasonal festivals, and public commemorations often required materials such as tents, furniture, and printed programs. Although multiple suppliers existed within the region, records show a recurring reliance on firms whose ownership traced back to associates of the family. These arrangements gave the Blackmoors a quiet but persistent presence in nearly every public gathering, reinforcing their image as integral to the town's functioning, without overtly advertising their commercial role. The same logic applied to educational initiatives. In 1894, the town introduced a program to provide evening classes in bookkeeping, agricultural methods, and mechanical skills. While publicly described as a municipal project, it was financed in part through a trust managed by a board that included two individuals known for their connections to the estate. The program's venue, a refurbished hall near the market square, was leased from a property management company whose records list the Blackmoor estate as its primary shareholder. This layering of ownership and sponsorship ensured that even ostensibly independent projects remained within their sphere of influence. Archival material from local banks adds another dimension to this pattern. Loan ledgers from the period include a notable number of transactions involving borrowers who either leased space in Blackmoor-owned properties or supplied goods to their enterprises. In several cases, these borrowers received preferential terms such as reduced interest rates or extended repayment schedules. While there is no indication that the family directly intervened in these agreements, the overlap between their commercial network and the bank's clientele points to a shared understanding of mutual advantage. It was during these same years that a small but steady flow of goods began arriving in Fairford from overseas suppliers. Customs declarations, preserved in state archives, identify shipments of textiles, decorative items, and specialized tools consigned to companies operating out of addresses connected to the estate. The volume was not large enough to draw attention from regional trade monitors, but it provided a means of introducing distinctive products into local markets under the control of familiar distributors. These imports further differentiated Blackmoor-affiliated merchants from their competitors, enhancing their appeal to customers seeking goods unavailable elsewhere in the county. Socially, the family's position was reinforced through their hosting of select gatherings that brought together civic officials, business leaders, and visiting figures from cultural institutions. These occasions, held at the estate or at venues under their influence, served both as demonstrations of hospitality and as opportunities to align interests. The guest lists, though never publicly circulated, were known among attendees to include individuals whose decisions shaped the allocation of contracts, licenses, and investment opportunities in Fairford and beyond. Such gatherings also offered a controlled environment for introducing new ventures. On more than one occasion, municipal records show that projects announced shortly after these events involved entities linked to attendees. While the connections were never stated outright, the sequence of developments was notable to those who observed the town's commercial life closely. In each case, the outcome aligned with the pattern of ensuring that significant economic activity passed through channels associated with the estate. The intertwining of public and private roles was most apparent in the way the family's interests aligned with regional infrastructure planning. In 1895, a proposal was submitted for an improved road linking Fairford to a neighboring industrial centre. The plan was widely supported for its potential to reduce transport times. Examination of the proposed route, however, shows that it would pass directly by several properties controlled by companies with ties to the Blackmoors. Once completed, the road provided a faster and more reliable means of moving goods from those sites to the railway, reinforcing their logistical advantage without requiring any direct investment from the estate. As these arrangements continued, the estate's public image remained carefully curated. Public statements emphasized collaboration, shared prosperity, and the town's growing reputation as a hub of commerce and culture. The less visible mechanisms that supported this image operated through a combination of strategic property control, selective partnerships, and consistent presence in civic decision-making processes. The result was a system in which their influence was both pervasive and largely accepted, shaped not by overt declarations, but by a steady accumulation of practical advantages woven into the fabric of daily life in Fairford. The early months of 1896 saw an expansion in the use of intermediary companies to conduct transactions on behalf of the Blackmoor network. These entities, often registered under neutral names, acquired parcels of land, secured long-term leases, and negotiated supply contracts in ways that obscured any immediate connection to the estate. The legal documentation for these transactions was precise, with ownership details routed through multiple layers of holding agreements. This structure allowed the family to participate in a wide range of ventures while maintaining a public distance from their operational decisions. Shipping data from that year shows a marked increase in outbound goods classified as finished materials rather than raw products. This shift indicated a growing emphasis on manufacturing and processing, with several small factories in the surrounding counties identified as key contributors. Though few of these facilities bore the family's name, corporate records reveal overlapping directors, shared suppliers, and coordinated distribution routes with existing Blackmoor operations. This interconnected system ensured that production and transport were aligned to serve established commercial goals. Within the town itself, the influence of these arrangements became evident in the allocation of new business permits. Applications from merchants or tradesmen with ties to the Blackmoor network were processed efficiently, often approved within a fortnight. Others, especially those seeking to operate in sectors already occupied by affiliated businesses, encountered procedural delays. While official explanations cited the need for additional review, the outcome was consistent. Enterprises aligned with the estate's commercial structure were positioned to open and operate with minimal obstruction. The family's role in shaping public projects also became more pronounced. In 1896, the council approved the construction of a new civic hall intended for meetings, exhibitions, and public gatherings. The selected site was a property that had been sold to the town by a development company with known ties to the Blackmoors. The sale price matched fair market value, but the transaction ensured that the building's location would bring additional traffic to nearby properties within their network. The project was widely praised for its potential to enhance civic life, and the connection to the family's broader holdings remained an unspoken detail. Financial records from local banks in 1897 show an increase in loans underwritten for infrastructure improvements on properties linked to Blackmoor-affiliated ventures. These improvements included warehouse expansions, upgraded storage facilities, and the installation of new machinery. The timing of the loans often coincided with public works that enhanced access to these locations, such as road resurfacing or bridge repairs. Although the bank maintained its own lending criteria, the overlap between loan recipients and beneficiaries of municipal improvements was notable. In the cultural sphere, the family's sponsorship of select events continued to reinforce their public image. That year's Midsummer Fair included a pavilion dedicated to regional craftsmanship, featuring textiles, ceramics, and woodwork from artisans across the county. While the event was open to all, the majority of exhibitors were connected to supply chains that passed through the Blackmoor network. The pavilion's placement near the main entrance ensured that it attracted significant attention, and the association between the family's sponsorship and the success of the artisans further cemented their position as cultural patrons. The estate also engaged in subtle forms of information management. Notices regarding public projects, market expansions, or transport changes often appeared first in periodicals that had previously received donations from the family. This early access to information allowed their affiliates to prepare for changes ahead of the wider business community. In a competitive market, even a brief advantage could shape the outcome of negotiations or the timing of investments. By 1898, the pattern of integrating public benefit with private advantage had become a consistent feature of Fairford's development. The family's holdings, both direct and indirect, were positioned to capitalize on nearly every significant change in the town's infrastructure or commerce. When a new postal route was introduced that year, the location of its distribution points corresponded closely with areas containing Blackmoor-affiliated businesses. While the official justification emphasized service to outlying residents, the improved delivery times also enhanced the efficiency of the family's trading operations. The manner in which these advantages were secured reflected a long-standing approach. Rather than openly seeking control over municipal decisions, the estate worked through established relationships, reciprocal agreements, and shared economic interests. This allowed them to influence outcomes without attracting unwanted scrutiny. Decisions that might have prompted debate if pursued directly were accepted without question when presented as the result of standard civic planning. A further example of this approach occurred in the case of a proposed grain storage depot in 1898. The initial proposal came from a cooperative of farmers seeking to consolidate their harvests for more efficient transport. The council expressed interest, but the final plan placed the depot on land leased from a property group connected to the estate. This arrangement ensured that a portion of the cooperative's operational costs flowed into the network of holdings, while the facility's proximity to Blackmoor-controlled transport routes secured a degree of logistical dependence. As the century drew to a close, the estate's ability to align public works, private enterprise, and cultural engagement had reached a point of refinement that left little room for direct competition. The system they had cultivated over decades relied on an intricate balance of visibility and discretion. Their contributions to the town's outward progress were real and tangible, but each improvement was also a component of a broader strategy that sustained their position. Even in the final years before 1900, there was no significant public challenge to this structure. The benefits to the town were evident, and the mechanisms by which they were achieved remained largely invisible to those not directly involved. For most residents, the stability and prosperity that accompanied the Blackmoor era outweighed any curiosity about its underlying arrangements. This acceptance allowed the framework of influence to continue without interruption, setting the stage for its persistence into the next century. By the beginning of 1897, the outward appearance of the Blackmoor estate had changed little from its earlier decades, yet the town's perception of its role had become firmly established. In Fairford's public life, the family's name was synonymous with continuity. Residents had come to expect their involvement in ceremonial events, cultural programs, and selected civic developments. This expectation, though rarely expressed formally, shaped the way new initiatives were planned. Organizers often approached the family or their affiliates in the earliest stages, seeking either financial support or an implicit endorsement that could encourage broader backing. The quiet efficiency of this arrangement meant that many projects progressed along predictable lines. A proposal for a new reading room in the public library, introduced in 1897, demonstrated the process. The initial idea came from the town's literary society, which outlined a plan to expand the existing facility to accommodate growing demand. Before submitting their request to the municipal council, the society contacted Eleanor Blackmoor directly. Within weeks, a donation from a trust managed by her associates was pledged, accompanied by a commitment to cover the cost of interior furnishings. The council, presented with a project already supported by the family, approved it without amendment. While the reading room was widely welcomed, its design and function reflected certain preferences. The furnishings, ordered from a Boston supplier favored by the estate, featured a distinctive arrangement that matched the style of several rooms within the Blackmoor property. The decorative elements emphasized themes of agricultural and industrial progress, aligning with the image the family promoted throughout the town. These details, though subtle, contributed to a sense of coherence between public spaces and the aesthetic associated with the estate. In commercial matters, the same coherence appeared in the layout of market stalls and shop fronts near the central square. A review of property leases from the late 1890s shows that merchants occupying these spaces often had long-standing connections to Blackmoor enterprises. Whether through previous tenancy in their buildings, supply contracts, or shared participation in sponsored events, these merchants operated within a network that reinforced mutual advantage. The result was a concentration of commerce that mirrored the estate's established supply chains. Regional records from 1898 indicate that the family's reach extended beyond Fairford in ways not always visible to its residents. Corporate filings in neighbouring counties list companies involved in milling, storage and distribution, whose directorships included individuals known to reside on or near Blackmoor properties. These companies coordinated shipments that passed through Fairford's transport hubs, ensuring the town remained an active point in larger trade routes. For the local economy, this meant a steady flow of goods and the associated activity, though it also reinforced the centrality of the estate in maintaining those connections. Culturally, Eleanor's role remained significant. She continued to oversee art exhibitions, musical performances and lectures, often selecting subjects that reflected industriousness, education and refinement. Attendance at these events was steady, and press coverage in regional papers regularly credited the Blackmoors with enhancing the cultural profile of Fairford. While admission fees for such events were modest, the procurement of materials, the hiring of performers and the management of venues often flowed through businesses connected to the estate, keeping the operational aspects of culture within the same network that managed trade and property. The family also maintained a measured approach to charitable work. Contributions to public health initiatives, road improvements, and seasonal relief funds were timed to coincide with periods of high public engagement, such as harvest festivals or year-end celebrations. These moments of visibility ensured that their support was both recognized and remembered, reinforcing the association between civic welfare and the family's patronage. At the same time, their involvement was concentrated on projects that could demonstrate tangible results, avoiding commitments that carried uncertain outcomes. In the final years of the century, Fairford's governance reflected the long influence of this approach. Council members often framed decisions in terms that echoed the language used in Blackmoor-sponsored speeches and publications. Proposals that aligned with the family's priorities tended to pass with little debate, while those without a clear connection frequently underwent extended discussion or revision. The minutes from an 1899 session on municipal storage policy illustrate this pattern. A plan involving a facility on land leased from a neutral party stalled in committee, while an alternative arrangement on property managed by a known associate advanced to a vote and was approved. One of the more enduring features of the estate's influence was its role in managing the town's external image. When regional exhibitions or industrial fairs requested representation from Fairford, the selection process often involved consultation with the family or their affiliates. The individuals chosen to represent the town at such events were typically drawn from circles familiar with the estate's interests, ensuring that Fairford's presentation to outsiders remained consistent with the narrative of order, progress, and refinement cultivated at home. Physical access to the estate remained limited, but the visual presence of its gardens, walls, and architectural details continued to serve as a symbol of stability. The annual public viewing of the grounds in 1899 drew the largest attendance in its history, with visitors from neighbouring towns joining local residents for the guided tours. The event was accompanied by exhibitions of agricultural tools and industrial products, many sourced from companies within the Blackmoor network. This blending of cultural display and commercial promotion encapsulated the manner in which the estate operated, integrating public engagement with private enterprise in a way that appeared seamless to attendees. In the months following the turn of the century, Fairford's daily rhythms continued much as they had for decades. The town's reliance on established trade routes, its network of merchants, and its carefully managed cultural life all reflected the long-standing structures put in place under the family's guidance. For those who had grown up within this system, it was simply the way Fairford functioned. The boundaries between civic governance, commercial opportunity, and private influence were so closely interwoven that separating them would have seemed both unnecessary and impractical. By the summer of 1900, the Blackmoor estate's role in Fairford was recognized not through declarations, but through the quiet certainty with which their presence was factored into the town's affairs. Public meetings for civic projects continued to draw participation from a wide range of residents, but behind the formal discussions, it was understood that alignment with the family's perspective would make a proposal more likely to advance. This was not the result of overt directives. Rather, it had become an ingrained part of the town's decision-making culture. Property development during this period reflected a careful balance between growth and preservation. Parcels near the railway station, long considered prime locations, were gradually redeveloped into mixed-use spaces combining commercial and storage functions. The developers who undertook these projects were often those with proven connections to the estate's business network. This ensured that while the outward face of the town evolved, the underlying control of strategic areas remained in familiar hands. Trade activity continued to pass through channels established decades earlier. The transport of goods, whether agricultural produce, finished textiles, or imported wares, followed routes that maximized efficiency for companies within the network. Municipal records from 1901 show a slight increase in freight volume, credited publicly to the town's advantageous location. Less remarked upon was the fact that the additional capacity was absorbed largely by enterprises with pre-existing logistical ties to Blackmoor-controlled warehouses and distribution centers. Cultural events retained their prominence as a means of reinforcing the family's public image. The Autumn Festival of 1901 featured a series of lectures on technological innovation, paired with an exhibition of machinery and tools. Many of the displayed items were supplied by firms whose operations intersected with the estate's commercial holdings. Visitors experienced the event as a demonstration of Fairford's progress, but for those managing the displays, it was also an opportunity to strengthen trade relationships under the cover of civic celebration. At the same time, the estate remained attentive to the visual impression it projected. Periodic maintenance of the gardens, carriageways, and outbuildings was carried out with precision. The annual public viewing of the grounds in 1902 introduced a newly landscaped section that framed the main house from a particular vantage point along the visitor route. This carefully composed view emphasized symmetry and order, reflecting the same qualities that the family encouraged in Fairford's public works and commercial organization. The family's relationships with regional institutions also contributed to the durability of their position. Membership in trade associations, cultural boards, and philanthropic committees ensured that their voice was present in discussions that extended beyond the town's borders. Minutes from a regional commerce meeting in 1903 record Jonathan Blackmoor's eldest son advocating for improved coordination between rail and river transport. Within a year, adjustments to scheduling and docking procedures had been implemented, changes that coincidentally increased the efficiency of shipments from warehouses associated with the estate. While the family's influence was well established, it did not rest solely on economic arrangements. Their engagement in education continued to shape the next generation of Fairford residents. A vocational program introduced in 1904 offered training in bookkeeping, drafting, and agricultural management. The program was conducted in a facility leased from a property group within the Blackmoor network, and its instructors were drawn from both local professionals and specialists brought in from outside the region. This ensured that the curriculum reflected both regional needs and the operational priorities of the family's enterprises. By 1905, this integration of civic life, commerce, and cultural identity had become self-sustaining. Residents who participated in town affairs often did so through organizations or events linked in some way to the estate. Newcomers to Fairford quickly learned that progress was most easily achieved by working within this framework. The pattern was reinforced each time a public project succeeded under the family's sponsorship, or when a local merchant prospered through an arrangement that aligned with the established network. The family's approach to maintaining stability involved more than preserving existing structures. It also required adapting to gradual changes in the broader economic climate. When new trade routes opened through neighboring towns in 1906, the estate moved to establish partnerships, with carriers operating along those lines. This ensured that Fairford's position as a hub remained relevant, even as regional transportation patterns shifted. The adjustments were implemented quietly, with little fanfare, but the results kept the flow of goods steady and sustained the perception of the town's enduring prosperity. As the second decade of the century approached, the Blackmoor estate remained an unspoken reference point in nearly every matter of consequence in Fairford. Decisions about infrastructure, cultural initiatives, and commercial investment continued to intersect with their interests, often without conscious recognition by those involved. For most residents, this was not a matter of concern. The arrangement was familiar, its benefits visible, and its origins embedded in the town's history. The estate's gates, gardens, and carefully maintained facades still stood as the most recognizable landmark on the outskirts. Visitors to Fairford often remarked on its presence, and locals pointed to it as evidence of the town's refinement and stability. What lay beyond those gates was known only to a few, but the patterns that radiated outward from it shaped the life of the town in ways both direct and indirect. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story was taken from documents that were found. All names have been edited to protect the source.